Good afternoon and welcome to Center for Healthy Sex monthly webinar on the Mirror of Intimacy, Daily Reflections on Emotional and Erotic Intelligence. I'm Alex Katehakis and I'm the Clinical Director here at the Center for Healthy Sex and one of the co-authors of the book. And today we're going to talk about perversity, which I think is a very interesting topic on this July 10th, 2017. Perversity, as defined by Osho, also known as the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh, who was a Hindu teacher, or Indian teacher, I should say, he says if sex fails, then many perversions happen to the mind. These perversions are expressed in hatred. Hatred is a failure of sex, a failure of love energy. Violence, lust for money, the continuous conflicting attitudes of egos, war, politics, these are all sex perversions. So I think it's interesting that he thought of all of these as sexual perversions. So when he says if sex fails, then perversions happen in the mind and that they're expressed in hatred. So I think those statements are arguable, but what I think he was saying there is that if people are having sex and there is a failure during sex, let's say a male loses his erection, or a female has pelvic pain, or she's not that into it, or she can't orgasm, then it says perversions start to happen in the mind. So in other words, we start to distort what's going on between ourselves and our partners because we want to make up a story or a reason for why our bodies aren't operating, let's say, optimally. And then he makes a leap and says that these perversions are expressed in hatred. Now, Robert Stoller, who was a well-known psychologist, wrote a book called Perversion, the Erotic Form of Hatred. And he also talked about sexualized hostility. And so these sort of line up with that when we're angry, we can dump our anger into our sex and sexuality and express it in hatred. So Osho's saying when hatred is a failure of sex, it can be a failure of love energy. Certainly we could say hatred is a failure of loving, and that violence or lust for money or conflicting attitudes all become, in his words, sexual perversion. So if we were loving, if we were more sexually loving, then we wouldn't need to pervert the world in these violent ways. So the word perverse stems from the Latin phrase facing the wrong way, which I think is a great definition of the word, and of course that's the root of the word. But when I think about that, I think about, if you put your shoes on the wrong feet, you would say that's perverse. It's a perverted use of shoes because they're skewed, they're facing the wrong way. And in that case, I think that can define perversity in all sorts of contexts in the world. Perversion describes unconventional or even deviant behaviors or outlooks. So we could say that if somebody murders someone, that's perverse. If somebody does something that is deviant, like exposing themselves to someone who doesn't want to see their sexual genitals, then that is considered perverse. So facing the wrong way can be used in many different instances and contexts. Sometimes perversity refers to acts that are deeply corrupt or inappropriate. So when we find out that certain banking institutions are, opening accounts without our permission or stealing money, we would definitely call that perverse because it's corrupt. And it can also be thought of as a disruption of balance. So we could think of nature as becoming perverse as the earth heats up, for example. When temperatures in Los Angeles reach 90, 100 degrees, we would say that's a perversion of the weather. So think about all the ways in which the word perverse can be used. Oftentimes it's used strictly with sex, and it can be used to shame alternative sexual practices and behaviors. So let's think about that critically as we hopefully have a dialogue about perversion today. So I want to remind you that you can text me questions into this text box on the side of your screen just by writing in your questions, and I'm happy to answer them back to you. So feel free to any thought that comes into your head or question you have about this notion of perversity. Let's see if we can have a dialogue about it. So, for those seeking the addictive thrill of rule breaking, perversity can feel like liberation. It can be a chance to articulate a dark side that's unacknowledged by mainstream society. And I think this happens in adolescence with teenagers. There's a thrill to rule breaking. It can become sort of addictive, meaning there's a draw to do it over and over and over again. If the high of breaking the rule is great. So sometimes young people engage in all kinds of kooky behaviors like shoplifting or climbing onto buildings where they don't belong, or driving cars too fast. There's a perversity to that, especially if there's danger. For example, like driving and while drinking and driving cars too fast. But we all know that feeling of liberation, that feeling of like speeding in a car with the hair blowing through or the wind blowing through your hair. There's a sense of liberation. And that's what perversity can feel like too. It's a chance to articulate that part of ourselves that mainstream society says we should kind of batten down, not get too excited about. So it feels like an unleashing. That's what perversity can do for us. And it doesn't always have to be a bad thing. When we're exploring our sex and sexuality, for example, when we are exploring things, when we're sort of young people, or even as we age, this sense of liberation can give us a taste of who we once were. Oftentimes people go seeking some lost parts of themselves in what we could call perversion, in something that's non-normative, that's taboo, that's a little bit illicit, that's kind of naughty, as a way to feel sort of alive and excited. And so think about the ways in which you do that, maybe on a daily or regular basis, or maybe when the weekend rolls around. I saw an episode of a television show recently where one of the key players had found her majorette boots from high school, and putting those on made her feel, what did she say, plucky and bold and excited, and the shoes hurt her feet, so they were perverse. But the thing itself gave her an excitatory, renewed sense of herself. So we see perversity being expressed in artistic mediums sometimes. This can be a way to channel all sorts of things, including our collective trauma or our curiosities. This can become cathartic and a way to heal through this group communication. And all of us have seen that in art, or maybe even experienced it in art. If you're a painter or a musician or a writer or a dancer, that expressing this going in the opposite direction, this form of liberation or rebellion, can give us that freedom, and art often does exactly that. We've all seen paintings that we've loved and hated and been moved by and thought, I could do that myself, right? We have all sorts of experiences from art. But think about the way in which you might express your own artistic expression, the ways in which you maybe hold back from expressing your artistic expression that gives you that sense of liberation, even if it feels perverse, even if it feels like nobody would want to see that. Where do you hold yourself back from communicating? And can you see that in doing so, you're also maybe hampering a group consciousness or group collective that allows other people to resonate with what your experience is? So anybody have any questions or thoughts about that? I know people are just now finding our Facebook page. We were previously on an animating site, and this is a new platform for us. So if you have been lost in cyberspace, or you have friends maybe that are searching around for the old platform, so perversity a crucial differentiation. And this really is crucial to differentiate between what's taboo due to social inhibition and what's taboo because it causes real harm to others. One of the cultural wars I think we're in now, or we're about to embark on, is this sort of reining in of taboo because of social ideas. We are, I think, approaching a social revolution in our country, a new one, wherein those who want more social constraint, more social inhibition, have really moved to the foreground and are going to start to clamp down on the ways in which we express ourselves. And we're going to feel that in the form of, impingements possibly on our First Amendment, on how we express ourselves in the media. And that is based in a morality, not necessarily on a personal value. And that's why I want to challenge you today to think about what inhibits you socially because of the ways in which you were raised or what you were told was okay or wasn't okay, versus what inhibits you because it causes real harm to people. And ironically, oftentimes the people who have the most strident morals about social inhibition are actually engaging in behaviors that are taboo, that are gravely harmful to other people, whether it's corruption or lies and things of that nature. So examine yourself and ask yourself, where do I hold myself back because of some old idea that was passed on to me by my family, by some perhaps religious ideas that I don't necessarily believe in, by the culture I grew up in or the region I grew up in, and see what really fits for you today. Do those shoes actually fit? Are they comfortable, or do they feel perverse, like perversely tight? When I say shoes, I mean metaphor for these mores and ideas. So a gross example, and in my opinion a ridiculous example, is that in the past homosexuality was labeled a perversion, like bestiality and pedophilia. And all three of these things are extremely difficult. Homosexuality, it presumes mature consent, and certainly gay people can engage in non-consensual sex in the way that straight people can. But human beings, adult human beings, consent. Animals cannot give consent, and children cannot give consent, and that's why they should not be, one of many reasons they shouldn't be in the same category. But let's look at that and look at how oftentimes our sexuality is socially constructed by the times we're living in. There were times when women couldn't show their ankles or their legs because that was considered perverse. And so, we've come a long way from that, certainly. Now we have to look at maybe the extreme to which we've gone to that becomes perverse in different ways. So I would say or think that perhaps overexposure of our body parts can be perverse when we're exposing people who don't necessarily want to see those things. That's another form of exhibitionism or non-consent. Which rarely gets called out when it comes in an exhibitionistic form. So I don't mean exhibitionism where we typically think of a male exposing himself to people who don't want to see his body parts, typically his genitals, and typically it's females that don't want to see it, that are scared or made angry by that. I'm talking about the kind of exhibitionism where people show parts of their bodies in public that people may not want to see. Like their pants are too low, or they're showing too much cleavage, or too much stomach, or too much something that others may find offensive. And I've always thought it was interesting that if a man exhibits himself to a female, the female will call the authorities on that. But if a female exhibits herself to a straight male, he's never going to call the authorities on that. So perversion comes in many forms, is my point, and what's offensive to some people may not be offensive to other people. So any thoughts or questions about any of these things I'm talking about or ideas? So polygamy may seem like another wrongfully tagged perversion worth defending, as on the surface, no one appears to be coerced. So if somebody is in a polygamous relationship, and there's more and more information now about alternative lifestyles, alternative relationships, we have to assume that polygamy is not a perversion as long as the people involved in that configuration have consented to it. They've not been coerced, they've not been brought into the polygamous situation as a minor. So think about polygamy, or polyamory is probably a better word, but even polygamy. And think about what your judgments are about it when you hear that word. What comes to mind immediately? What do you think about when you think about that? How offensive does it seem to you? Do you shut down the conversation in your own head by not being open-minded to learning more about, well, how does that actually work, and how do people do it, and what do they like about it, and how will they know if it's not liking it, if they're not liking it, and when will they, are they able to end it if they don't want to do it anymore? So activating curiosity as opposed to naming something perverse. Where we have a culture of ingrained gender inequality, then polygamy will violate human rights. And that's why I think most of us jump to this notion about polygamy being perverse or inappropriate or not right. So judgments about perversity can't be pronounced outside of their social context, ever. And that's where I think we sort of fail as a culture at large, is that we make blanket statements, blanket judgments, blanket evaluations very, very quickly, and assumptions without thinking about or getting curious about the social context in which they exist and which they are born out of. So these things can be irrevocably linked to the mores of the era or the region or the location people live in, and can change as ideas evolve and times change also. So Paul says, my one question around this post this morning had to do with polygamy, or polygyny really, in Native American societies of the past, and how to think about it cross-cultural context. And I think that's what I'm talking about, is that in sort of Western modern culture, we don't think about polygamy as much as we think about polyamory, which is the right to be in relationship with multiple people, and all these people know about the other people also. Polygamy can imply that typically there is a male who has multiple wives as opposed to a female who has multiple husbands. We don't hear about that very often. And those systems were set up at a time when people were looking to birth a lot of children because they had a farm to run, or they were crossing the plains and they needed people power, manpower. And in Native American traditions also, these constructs were created as a way to form societies and villages. And that's why the context is incredibly important to this. So I hope that answers your question, that cross-cultural context, social context is important when we think about alternative practices that we may be quick to label as perverse. David says, if I never heard the word perverse again, it would be too soon. And I like that also, because I think about perverse as, you know, buying a tomato and it's got some weird lump on it, that's a perversion of what a tomato should look like. But that's about the extent of it. Or again, as I said earlier, if somebody is a murderer, or they're engaging in really disgusting, corrupt activities, that's a perversion of the natural order of things. But when it gets applied to sex, I think we have to be very, very careful about that term, because it's inherently shaming. It's also inherently colonizing to a normative standard of what's okay and what isn't. If we become gripped by obsession or break our own codes of healthy conduct, we become perversions of our true selves. Then that is for us to determine what I think is perverse for me, not for you to call me perverted or to say that that's a perversion of what I should or shouldn't be doing. So this is where I think our own self-reflection comes into play, where we look at how we are breaking our own codes, our own values, what we think is healthy or not healthy. And even in that, to consult with a trusted other, a therapist or a good friend or someone to say, you know, I feel shame about this, let's say, sexual behavior I'm engaging in, and it feels perverted to me, but boy, I really like it. That is a conversation with a therapist to see if is the thing really violating my value system, or is it that I feel shame because I think it makes me a bad person, or I would never want my mother to know I was doing it, or I'm worried about what my friends would think if they knew. These are small slices that every person has to explore and determine for themselves before those questions can be answered. I've talked to many people who, in their sexual addiction or compulsivity, were engaging in behaviors that they said were a real violation of their personal values, and that they did a lot of things that violated those personal values. So their desire was to stop violating their value system, not a value system that was being imposed on them, but what they believed was really true for them. And so in that, we go through, or I take people through, a lot of questions and conversations about that. I'm also tracking what's happening with them emotionally and physiologically to see how their body's reacting, to see what's really true for them viscerally, so that we can ferret out what the truth is about what's okay sexually and what isn't really. And people need a stable psychological core, I think, to make these determinations. Healthy sexual experimentation can mushroom into debilitating, time-consuming fixations and fetishes that, like drug addiction, can bring more pain than pleasure. So I've had clients who have had fetishes who have been consumed by them. They've lost marriages because of them. They have started to feel broken and damaged because of them. And the fetish itself was such that they weren't really having that much sex. They were just engaged in the obsession of the fetish, which kept them from really having relationships with the other people. They report feeling not just controlled by it, but that they were very controlling and used the fetish to control other people because they didn't feel good about themselves. So again, these are very thin slices, they're very personal, and they're ones that we have to really spend some time thinking about and asking ourselves about. Conversely, judgment or justice becomes perverted when those who deviate from society's behavioral standards are cruelly and unusually punished. And we could spend hours talking about this particular statement, that I think our social justice and our sort of just justice processes when it comes to incarceration and the prison industrial complex in this country is a gross perversion of how we cruelly and unusually punish people for crimes they either didn't commit or they committed as young people, and rather than moving towards rehabilitation and helping people, we tend to cruelly and unusually punish people, oftentimes, sadly, people who are addicts or mentally ill, in ways that are really unconscionable. And this, I believe, is a perversion of our humanity and human justice. Someone writes here, I hear that objectifying people and trying to unionize, I'm not sure what that means exactly, but so maybe if you can get clear about what you're saying, or if you have a question, I'm happy to answer that, Max. So we have to navigate these extremes of perversity and sanctimony, because regardless of tradition or societal judgments, it's now up to each of us individually to learn to, quote, face the right way. What is right for you? How are you facing the right way? Maybe you like having your shoes on different feet because it's kind of fun for you. And even though it's perverted, and over time it will goof up your knees and your hips. So hopefully you're not doing it every day, but you kind of like stepping out of bounds and playing with those edges. It is perverse, and it is against what tradition dictates. You have to navigate that for yourself. How much of it would be too much? How much of it would be too often? How much of it is actually hurting you? And I don't know that would hurt other people, but it would certainly hurt your body over time. And so Max said, not turn people into objects. And I would say yes. I think when fetishism becomes strictly about turning the other into an object, then we have to look at, I think, our own dissociative structures and the ways in which we're not present, or that we don't want to be seen, or that we're using power and control over other people in a way that's not necessarily consensual, meaning you haven't had a conversation about it. You're not in agreement about how you're going to do this particular thing. That these are ways that perversion and sex and sexuality can start to move into the manipulative, into even the nefarious at times. So be mindful about how you're using your sexual preferences, objectification, and fetishes. Any other thoughts about that? Okay, so moving along then. So what is healthy perversity? Have you ever indulged in a fantasy or performed a sexual act you considered perverse? And if so, recall the surrounding details. What were you feeling at the time you did it? And what drove the behavior? I would also ask, first of all, what had you having the idea that this would be a good idea or a fun idea? How old were you? And how was the situation resolved, or maybe reconciled or rectified? And that may mean that it was actually really fun for you and you wanted to do it again, and the resolution was that you incorporated it into your sexual repertoire. Maybe on the other end it made you feel excited to begin with, but afterwards you felt really dirty or gross about it. And the reason you did it is because somebody else wanted you to do it. And it's not that it wasn't consensual, it was. And you resolved it by deciding that you weren't going to do that thing again because it made you feel too icky. And if it did you ever end up trying it again to test it, to see if it did? And did you have the same result or a different result? So, sort of a benign example of that is that, you know, there's a certain kind of weightlifting that I can't do because it hurts my back. And periodically, I try it just to see if it still hurts my back. And sure enough, it almost always hurts my back. And so my back is kind of sore for a day. And then I realize, oh, you know what, I really can't do that thing. So that's something I think is human nature also. We sort of check back in to see if it's true. And for those of you that have struggled with sexual addiction or compulsivity, you may on occasion, you know, want to check in and try something that you had tried when you were really kind of in the throes of your behaviors. And sometimes people will find that, you know what, this is actually okay. I can engage in this sexual behavior again. What was perverted was not the sexual act. What was perverted was my mind and the ways I was using it, and the fact that I was doing it incessantly and manipulating people and hurting people and lying about it. That was the problem, not the sex act itself. So these are things that I think are incumbent upon all of us to kind of check in with periodically, so that you don't keep your sex and sexuality in this narrow band. And I think that's one of the misunderstandings of sexual recovery, is this idea that people have to stop all their sexual behaviors, they can't ever engage in them again, and they're relegated to, you know, missionary style sex. And that is absolutely not the case, and that is not the message from the sex addiction community. The message is that you should be having the kind of erotic, interesting, delightful sex you want to have, but you've got to get back in there and figure out what's okay for you and what isn't. Patricia writes, what can you say about a man who likes she-males? His wife knows he likes it, but not that he does it. Oh, so the wife knows about it, but she doesn't know that he's actually engaging in sex with transsexuals. He doesn't cheat with females and doesn't consider she-males as cheating. So I'd like to substitute the word transsexuals because I think it's less pejorative. So you're saying that this man has sex with transsexuals, and his wife knows that he likes having sex with transsexuals, but he doesn't know that she knows that he's actually been doing that. And that he does have sex with people, and he doesn't consider that cheating. Well, I think that is an interesting loophole, because if we have an agreement about a monogamous committed relationship, that means no sex outside of the relationship. We'll call it a marriage for shorthand, even though, many people are not married. Then anytime we have sex outside of that agreement, we are in fact cheating. If you have a non-monogamous contract, then you have to follow the explicit agreements of that non-monogamous contract. So this person, whomever he's having sex with outside of the monogamous contract, is lying to himself and he's lying to his partner about it. And it doesn't matter whether it's another female, another male, a transsexual, somebody who identifies as pansexual. It doesn't matter. It's another living being and he's having sex with that person. So I hope that answers your question. That's sort of like the old idea that if a man has receptive sex with another man, he's gay, but if he is the person who is, the top, or the person who's penetrating, then he's not gay. And these are sort of bizarre little loopholes and ideas that people come up with to tell themselves that they're not really doing what they're doing. So it sounds like that person needs to have an explicit conversation with his therapist, for starters, and then be honest with himself and honest with his partner about the kind of sex he wants to have and the kind of relationship he wants to have. So Max says, because the mindset around sex, that is the real work, I find, even as I am abstinent. And I would say yes. And here's the thing. Sex Addicts Anonymous really propagates abstinence. The whole directive in SAA is don't have sex. Do not have the kind of sex you are having. This is how you create a circle plan, and whatever you do, don't engage in those behaviors. There's no roadmap for what to engage in and how to have sex. Sex and Love Addicts Anonymous, SLAA, spends a lot more time in that fellowship looking at the sexual anorexia that sets in when people stop having problematic sex. So that fellowship is more curious about the way people avoid sex. So avoiding sex or not having sex is not sexual recovery. Sexual recovery is an integration of your sexuality. So I always say it's not the sex that's the problem, it's the abuse of sex. Chocolate cake is not a problem. If you eat the entire chocolate cake and you're sick to your stomach, that's the problem. So while you are in an early recovery process or a sexually abstinent process, it's important to start asking yourself, what are the sexual behaviors I engaged in while I was acting out that I actually really liked, that brought me pleasure? What are the behaviors I engaged in that really created problems for me? Was it the sexual behavior, or was it my lying about it that was really the problem? And I've had many people tell me, especially if they were really hardcore porn addicts, where they would isolate, masturbate to porn for hours on end, were lying to their spouse about it. They get into SAA, they get into sexual recovery, and they start to have sex with their partner again, and they'll say, you know what, if I start looking at internet porn again, it's going to click off that thing in my brain, and then I'm going to be off to the races, and I'll be on a binge acting out, so I really can't do that. I respect that if somebody says that to me, and you have to be the arbiter of what's true for you, and you have to have enough recovery, and I think have enough people in recovery around you to bounce these ideas off of, to get honest with yourself about what's really true. So don't make these decisions in a vacuum, because sex addiction is about isolation, make them in consultation. Do it with a friend. Do it with another person in program. Do it with a guy in your group therapy. Talk to your therapist about it. Start to really have conversation about sex and sexuality, even in a forum like this that's really explicit, so you can notice if you feel shame about it, and notice where the shame is coming from and what's really true for you. And so, Paul, you are welcome about that when you say these are really kind words for us. Yeah, sexual recovery should be about a celebration of your sexuality, being able to have sex without shame, certainly, whatever that is. Because oftentimes people in recovery will start to engage in sexual behaviors, and they'll consider those behaviors shameful and therefore perverse, as opposed to, no, that act is not shameful and it's not perverted, your feeling about it is. And where does that feeling come from? Who told you that was not an okay thing to do? I really believe that our sexuality is as varied as our fingerprints. There are no two sexualities that are the same, and no two sex addicts act out the same way, ever. I go through people's cycles of addictions with them in our intensive program at Center for Healthy Sex all the time, and everybody's cycle is different, and the way people do it is different, and what they like and what they don't like really is as different as our palates. You know, some people think certain foods are delicious and other people think they're repulsive, and some people eat the same foods over and over again, and some people like a wide variety of food. So sex is really very, very much the same. So the more you can, have less shame about your sex and sexuality, the healthier your sexuality is going to be. Do you have secrets, I would say, especially about your sexuality, that you will take to the grave? And recall every perversion you're too ashamed to share. And I think that's a good place to start to look at what you really like sexually. What these things were, what things were at issue for you that you consider perverse. And know that you're not alone. These phrases like take it to the grave exist because many people feel that way, but the problem with take it to the grave is that that thing weighs on us in such a way that I believe it sends us to our grave faster. And it's not just one thing, but all the things that we accumulate that we're so ashamed of, that we're so afraid that people aren't going to love us for. The more we tell the truth, the less burdened we are by shame, and the better we feel about ourselves. So taking these dark, dirty secrets to the grave really leaves us in a place of being victims, I'm sorry to say, and martyrs, because there is nothing you've done that someone else hasn't done or done worse of, believe me. Every day I hear things I thought I would never hear before, I didn't even know existed, and so it's just never that bad. So unburden yourself today. There's a saying in the 12-step program, tell the truth and tell it faster. Find somebody today that you can tell your deepest, darkest sexual, quote, perversion to, and just unburden yourself by it, and know that you're just normal. You're just a normal human being, and you started doing these things for whatever reasons, and hopefully as you learn the reasons, you start to make better choices and you stop doing what you're doing. And then summon unconditional love for those damaged parts of yourself which haven't been integrated yet. Those are the segregated parts. When people talk about my addict, that's really, segregation, where you cordon off this part of yourself that was so damaged in childhood because you were neglected terribly or shamed, or there was some sort of religious abuse or physical abuse that told you weren't good enough, or that sex was dirty, or any number of other perverted and distorted images. Those perverted images make us feel sexually perverted when we just want to have sex in a regular, normal way. So be kind to yourself as you uncover these things. And if it feels safe, address any unhealthy perversion in your life, whether past or present. How would you turn that thing in the right direction? Because if perversion is just about going in the wrong direction, how do you turn it around and move it in the right direction? Sometimes it's the simplest thing. Just the act of telling somebody about the thing you're most ashamed of automatically turns it in the right direction, because you realize, wow, I did that a long time ago, or I used to do that, I'm not doing it anymore, or I want to stop doing that today, and for today I'm going to go in the right direction. That is all it takes to be on a path of the reclamation of the self, really, and stopping to segregate all of these parts and beginning the process of integration, which is the process of self-love. And I think the end goal for psychotherapy and for sexual recovery is ultimately the ability to love oneself unconditionally, without shame, and the capacity to love another deeply, to have deep, deep intimacy where you reveal your sexuality to that person because it's exciting and fun and delicious, and not because it's shameful or you're embarrassed, because you fully show up as who you are. So Paul asks a question about SLAA and SAA, because I was comparing those two, and a little bit about SA. And I want to be a little careful here about SA, because I know some of you only have the fellowship of SA in the region of the country you're living in. So if that's the only 12-step program you have, that's all you have. You can always start another one yourself, you know. So Sexaholics Anonymous, and this is my understanding, really defines sexual sobriety as no sex outside of a monogamous committed relationship. And historically that has meant outside of a heterosexual committed relationship, meaning a marriage between a male and a female. They also define sobriety as no lust of the mind. So I have a contention with the problem of lust of the mind, because lust is one of the 7 circuits in all mammals. It's just a part of how we are wired. And this circuitry begins in the brainstem. We are lustful creatures. In fact, all mammals have lust as one of these circuits, just as seeking and care and play and rage and panic and grief are also, and rage, are circuits in all mammals. So to try to eradicate this natural circuit is, I think, impossible. Using the 3-second rule so that you're not gawking at people, so you're not objectifying, going into euphoric recall, things of that nature is certainly useful. But to say that if you lust after another human being you're going to lose your time, I think it makes it very challenging for people to have their time over time. So the shortcoming of SAA, I believe, is this notion of lust, and this idea that you can only have sex in a monogamous committed relationship. Because if you're single, you're going to be in trouble. If you're single and you're in sexual recovery, then I think it's really important to determine what you like sexually, and it's really important to date people and have casual sex and experiment with your sexuality to find out what is within the bounds of healthy sex for you and what tips over into your old addictive behaviors. So you should be mindful about the fellowship that you join, and you should get clear about how they define sobriety and how you get to define sexual sobriety so that you're in the right fellowship. Now, if you're in a monogamous committed heterosexual marriage and no sex outside of your marriage is your bottom line, then SA would be perfect for you. It doesn't mean that, well, you would have to determine what that meant for you and how you would define it. But if you are gay or if you're single, you're going to find that fellowship a much more challenging fellowship for you, and I worry a shaming fellowship for you. And again, meetings are comprised of people. So you could find an SA meeting that has really great, forgiving, loving, compassionate people in it, then that's great. Or people that are perhaps more rigid or by the book, in which case you may find that that's not the right place for you. So hopefully that answers your question. And remember, 12-step meetings and fellowships can be as perverse as anything else. So you want to find one that is not perverting or distorting the intentional meaning of the program, which is to help people not just stop the problematic behaviors, but start to define what is healthy sex for you, so that you can start moving in the right direction. So does anybody have any other questions before we stop here? Well, as always, I want to remind you that Mirror of Intimacy is available online at Amazon.com, where you can buy the paperback book. This book, as you may know, has won multiple awards, and we are endlessly grateful to all of our readers for their enthusiasm, for buying the book, for passing the book on, and to remember to share your reviews on Amazon.com, even if it's a single sentence about how the book affected you or how it moved you. All right, so today, July 10th, 2017, sort of in the dead of summer. I hope you have a terrific week. I hope you think a lot about this matter of perversity and what your sexual pleasures are, and what's really okay for you versus the things you tell yourself are not okay, and that you have conversations about the most shaming sexual acts you've engaged in with somebody you care about and that you trust this week, so that you can start to come out of that shame and start moving in the right direction with your sexuality. Thank you, and I look forward to seeing you all next month.